Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of the John Lyons Show. I'm John Lyons, and I'm joined today by historian and author James M. Scott, the author of 7 books. The most recent of one, Empire of Ashes, traces the end of the war in the Pacific in World War II. I've already read most of it. It's a great book out on August 4th. We're going to get into that, the book itself, many other topics on today's show. But, James, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely, John. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners today.
Let's trace, James, before we get into the book itself, kind of your journey up to this point. How did you get into writing, history, the Pacific War? I mean, what led you to the point you're at now?
Absolutely. So not to date myself too much, but way back when I first finished up college back in the 1990s, I was a public school teacher in Japan. And it was a one of those, they bring over about 2,400 Western teachers each year to teach. I taught junior high school English. And that really kind of introduced me, on a granular level to World War II. Of course, I'd covered it in high school and in
Sure.
college and history classes, but that was an opportunity to meet people who had lived during that time period, who had remembered the fire raids, who had family members who fought. It also gave me an opportunity to visit places like Hiroshima, Tokyo, Kyoto, a lot of the places featured in this book. So it really kind of sparked my interest in World War II and specifically about World War II in the Pacific. Um, for me, I think really kind of, however, the crowning moment kind of came when I went and visited. I'd gone to visit Hiroshima with some friends, and then I flew to Hawaii to meet my parents for my spring break, and we visited Pearl Harbor. And so I really kind of within the span of just a couple of
Yeah.
weeks, I sort of saw these two places that really bookend the American experience in the Pacific in World War II, and something just kind of clicked. Started reading about it, got interested. I spent a number of years as a print journalist, newspaper reporter, covering more contemporary conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq. And then I had an opportunity to go back to school when I was about 30, and I used that time to sort of go back to what interests me most, which was World War II in the Pacific. And now here we are, a couple decades later, I'm still writing books.
Yeah, and this is your books, this is the third one about the air war in the Pacific. First one about the Doolittle raid, then you had Black Snow, which centered a lot around Curtis LeMay, the fire raids, especially that March 9th, 10th raid on Tokyo. Now Empire of Ashes. Was there anything specific about the air war component of it that you really latched onto when it came to writing these books?
Yeah, I don't think it gets enough coverage. I mean, the Doolittle story is just such an amazing story, and so I really wanted
Yeah.
to do that one. I'd grown up hearing about it, and really wanted to do that. And then the fire raids really just don't get any coverage. Everybody kind of knows Hiroshima, but they don't really. They kind of skip right over the campaign that led to that. And so what had actually happened is when I was working on Black Snow, I spent a good bit of time in Japan. I was interviewing survivors of the fire raids, and while I was there, I went down to Hiroshima and visited the museum. I interviewed some survivors, and so I came back with all this material that had never before been published in English.
Yeah.
So I loaded it all into the first draft of Black Snow. And when my editor read that first draft, he said, this is not a book about Hiroshima. This is a book about Tokyo. That's all a different book. And so and he was right about that. He was very wise. So we cut all that out. And then when I finished with Black Snow, I had all this material that very much interested me. And I thought, well, let's kind of revisit that component of it because the air war, fire raids kind of lead up to the atomic missions. And it kind of gave me an opportunity to go back, spend more time, talk to more people, gather more accounts. Also, really examine the politics of war termination from the American and the Japanese perspective, and also look at what it was like for Harry Truman, to have to make one of the most consequential decisions of any world leader ever. And so I was just really quite frankly, this book just flowed right out of the last one, and in a lot of ways it kind of wrote itself. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the research, I enjoyed the writing, I enjoyed the people I met, I enjoyed visiting these spots in Japan. So it was just this was a natural in a lot of ways.
And I have the book here, the newest one, Empire of Ashes. I gotta say, great book. Really enjoyed and as someone that I fancy myself an amateur World War II historian and history buff. Great read. And you mentioned Harry Truman, and you've spent a good deal, especially of part one of this book, charting his rise from the relative, unknown guy, World War I veteran, haberdashery owner, county judge to senator to, I mean, the interesting thing, and if you've read a biography of Truman, which I know you have, this isn't, he almost didn't win his 1940 race for Senate. And then 5 years later, he's in charge of the United States as they finish off World War II. It just felt like Harry Truman truly was almost an everyday man in a lot of respects, but then in other respects, he was a truly unique individual. And that really came out to me while reading your book.
Yeah, I loved writing about Truman, and I loved going out to and visiting, where he grew up and spending time in the museum there. And I've spent a lot of time over the years researching FDR, and so and there's a lot of ways I feel like I kind of know FDR. I've spent so much time going through his papers and reading all the accounts that it was a nice opportunity to kind of jump in with Truman because you really could not have two more different individuals than
Yeah.
FDR and Harry Truman. I mean, FDR was just this American aristocracy, a product of elite schools like Groton. He'd spent his summers, in Europe, and I mean, he was sophisticated politically, education wise, all of that. And then you got Truman, who is the absolute polar opposite. I mean, he is, as you said, he doesn't get any more of an everyday man than Harry Truman. He grew up on this tiny farm out in Missouri. I mean, and this I always loved this. His wife was from the town of Independence with 6,000 people, and like her family looked down on his family because he was considered too rural. And I'm like, her town was 6,000 people, and that was like the big city, And
Yes.
yet here you got Truman, and he's out there. He spends his first 12 years or so as an adult literally walking along behind a mule, and it's just this
Yeah.
tiny patch of Missouri earth is like all he knows, and it's a life governed by the seasons and the rains and the frosts, and yet somehow this guy is going to ultimately find himself in the driver's seat in the most pivotal moment in American history in a lot of ways of the 20th century, and I was fascinated with how do you get from A to B in that case.
And I wonder too, like Truman's experience in World War One, in a way that almost I think gave him a layer of credibility when he took over for FDR, because there were a lot of people questioning whether Truman was up to the job. Truman himself, said it felt like the moon and the stars fell on him, and he said, "Pray for me, guys," to the press corps. But it felt like that gave him a little layer of extra credibility when he ultimately took office, obviously to make some of the biggest decisions in human history in 1945.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. In fact, one of the anecdotes I love is, Truman, after FDR dies, I think he's in just as much shock as the nation, even though he knew, I mean, everybody knew FDR was in terrible shape. I mean, Truman knew it, he'd seen him. But when he died, it's still just a shock. I mean, it was, he'd been president for over 4,000 days. Even though, I mean, he was kind of like a comfortable pair of blue jeans. You just always expected to have him around, and
Yeah.
then suddenly he's dead. And I think Truman keeps sort of spouting off about how shocked he is. And I love this scene where Jimmy Burns, who's ultimately is going to be a Secretary of State and was a really close aide to FDR, has to pull him aside, and he's like, snap out of it, man. You can't be telling the country how shocked you are and how not cut out for this you are. Like everybody's looking at you to lead the country right now. You got to rise to the occasion. And I love that moment because I think it captures so much about Truman, the country, the shock of it all, that even the guy who was his vice president is stunned by it. And so I think that's such a pivotal moment. And I do think that there is, I mean, for the first time, the Republicans and the Democrats kind of come together and they realize, wow, this is, Germany, yes, is on the ropes, but Japan, we're still, estimated it could be 18 more months. Fortunately, it didn't end up that long, but there's still a long road to go for Tokyo. The economy is being transitioned from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. You got 16 million men and women coming out of uniform. I mean, like there's a lot going on, and you've
Yeah.
got and there's a real sense that like Truman was not FDR's first choice to be VP. In fact, he was the third choice, and so everybody's got to cut this guy some slack. But to Truman's credit, he didn't come in cocky or arrogant and say, I've got this. He
Yeah.
recognized it was such a learning curve. And he dove right in and just said, I gotta educate myself. I've got to work twice as hard as everybody else. I've got to sit down with all FDR's people. I've got to learn everything I can learn. I got to take home the briefing books. I mean, he studied so much he literally wore out his eyes, and that says a lot because he was already wore glasses and whatnot. But he exhausted himself, and to his great credit, he was successful in doing so.
And I think one of the reasons he had to study so much was the dynamic between him and FDR, because as you kind of illustrate, he's on the outside looking in. They don't really get together. He's not told about the atomic bomb beforehand. Like, was that something when you're researching? Were you surprised by that? Because, like, when FDR was reelected in 1944, he's got to know, hey, I'm not in good health here. And that was part of the reason Truman was picked, but he's still had him on the outside looking in all the way up until his death. I mean, that's something to me. I think it's, in FDR's illustrious career, I do think that's a failure to not bring him in more early. I was just curious your perspective on that as you researched it.
Oh, I think you're spot on, John. I think that's a huge failure on FDR's part. It's a blind spot, and it was kind of how he managed. He cut out, and not only did he cut out Truman, he cut out the State Department. I mean, he basically ran his administration himself with a handful of few aides that he really trusted, and everybody else was just kind of outside his orbit. But going into the 44 election, and he knew he was in bad health. Everybody else knew he was in bad health. That's why the 44 election was so consequential, and so much energy was placed on who would be his running mate. He had an opportunity those 88 days before he died to help educate Truman, to recognize I've got to get him over this learning curve, and he chose not to do it. In fact, if anything, he was kind of disdainful of him. He basically said when he heads off to Yalta to meet with the other Allied leaders, he basically says, "Don't reach out unless you absolutely have to. Like the White House is on fire, fine, but otherwise, just stay back." And Truman kind of at that point just says, "All right, fine, I'll just go do what I know how to do, which is go back to the Senate." He'd spent 9 years in the Senate. He had a good relationship with senators on both sides of the aisle, and he just kind of goes back there and presides over the day to day of the Senate. In fact, he's there writing a letter during some boring, talk over some legislation about water issues between the United States and Mexico. He's writing a letter to his mom when FDR dies, and of course he has to rush to the White House, has no idea what's happened at that point, and only to find out that he is, he goes thinking he's going to go see the president, to find out he is the president. So no, he's met with FDR a handful of times, largely for ceremonial issues. He has no real clue on the Manhattan Project. He has no real clue on U.S. relations with what's going on with Russia, what's going on with Great Britain. Of course, this is a pivotal moment. Germany's about to fall. Russian influence is spreading across Eastern Europe and threatening Western Europe. Of course, Japan, the whole what's going to happen in the Pacific. He has to figure all this out from the ground up on his own without any help from FDR.
Let's get to you mentioned the Manhattan Project because that's where Truman's first major decision comes in. Obviously, there's the debate of do you invade Japan? Do you blockade Japan? Do you drop the bomb? How do you drop the bomb? He has the interim committee to help him with that. But when you went through the Manhattan Project in this book, there were two details that really blew me away. And I was curious to your thoughts. One, a lot of the uranium came from the Belgian Congo and it was in Staten Island, just kind of stored there for a while and the State Department didn't want it. And then the other detail that blew me away is that Oak Ridge, the facility there, was half the cost of the entire Manhattan Project. I mean, those two like I guess hey, they got uranium for the bomb, but you don't think where. And like, oh, they had the Oak Ridge facility, but it dwarfed Los Alamos in cost. And so, like, I just those two details specifically to me, James, really blew me away reading your book.
Yeah, I totally nerded out on the Manhattan Project. Like that just appealed to my inner nerd.
Yeah.
Like I could, and I could sense when I was writing that chapter, if I'm not careful, this thing's going to spiral into half the book. But because it is such a fascinating period, and it is, what went into building the atomic bomb, and I'll tell you and I always say this. One of the most underrated figures in World War II history is without a doubt Leslie Groves. And he
Yeah.
is I look at Leslie Groves much the way I looked at Curtis LeMay in my book Black Snow, which is these are figures who are hugely consequential at this moment in history, and yet somehow history just skirted right past them and
Yeah.
forgotten all about them. I mean, it's so much so that when Oppenheimer came out, I mean, when you know the story of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer is actually a very small part of it. I mean, he runs one of the three atomic cities. He's not a Nobel laureate. I mean, his job is basically an administrator to help push these scientists around. It is Leslie Groves who runs everything. And of course, Leslie Groves, for folks who are thinking back of the movie Oppenheimer, he is the Matt Damon character. And of course, he would have loved the fact that Matt Damon played him in that movie because Leslie Groves had this huge ego, even though history would kind of forget him. But he was definitely not Jason Bourne. If you looked at Leslie Groves next to Matt, but he was a consequential figure. He got so much stuff done. I mean, he had to buy the land where these cities were going to go, figure out how to develop them, and building these cities. I mean, that's one of the things that fascinated me is we think, oh well, you're building in this atomic city, so you got to have some factories and laboratories. Like no, you got to have sewer systems. You got to have
Yeah.
transportation systems, bus systems, garbage pickup, power plants. You got to have schools, elementary, preschool. I mean, hospitals, clinics, vaccination programs. I mean, you start thinking about what it took to build these cities and do it all top secret. and it's just an incredibly and Groves had to do all of that. I mean, Oppenheimer has this one small part, which is let's take the uranium, let's take the plutonium, let's figure out the ballistics and how to bring them together and come up with a triggering mechanism. Groves is the one that has to just build entire cities. And so I found him to be such a fascinating individual. Also because people either loved him or hated him. I mean, he was a very polarizing figure. He was a tremendous doer. He got things done, but a lot of people just he rubbed everybody the wrong way. But in a lot of ways, that's probably what it took to get that kind of job done, with the in the time that it took to get it done in order to play a decisive role in the war. So I found the Manhattan Project, as you noted, and I drove out to Oak Ridge and spent some time
Oh
out
wow.
there when I was doing research on the book, and because I really wanted to see it all. And there's not a ton left. There is a new museum out there, and there are some spots out there you can kind of see it, but there's not as much of it left as I would have liked to have had. But I totally nerded out on all of the Manhattan Project stuff. So
And I think just as impressive as Groves did all this on the heels of building the Pentagon way ahead of schedule. Like, like you could make the case that three biggest construction projects of World War II are the Pentagon, the Manhattan Project, and the B-29, and he's in charge of two of them. And
and
like
he
they're
flew the
both
third.
success.
It's
Yeah, yeah, right. He flew the third. Like it's just, it is. You're right, and I think him even more so than LeMay because I think they're both. You're right. History skirted by both of them, but I think there is a segment of people that know LeMay. If you didn't see the movie Oppenheimer and you're just kind of the average American, you might have no idea who Groves is at all. And I just, you're right though. He was, if not for him, maybe there is no Manhattan Project, or maybe it takes twice as long and it's not as successful. Like he really is one of those pivotal figures who, whether you like him, don't like him, never gets enough credit for the work that was done.
100% agree. And one of his philosophy, and then this ended up being the absolute right philosophy, was he told all his guys, he goes, if you come to a fork in the road, you're going to either go left or you're going to go right. You go both directions, because we can't afford for you to go a year down the road to the left to realize you went the wrong way, and we got to backtrack now to go in an opposite direction. He's like, I will bankroll whatever you have to do.
Yeah.
You go do it. In fact, I mean, he ultimately goes to takes all the silver out of Fort Knox. In fact, at one point to actually
Yeah.
use it for conducting purposes. I mean, he got it done, and it's astonishing. To think how fast they were able to do that. And you got to remember, nowadays we live in an era of AI and computers and all this kind of stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
they were building this stuff with slide rules and human computers. And you mentioned the Pentagon. I mean, 16 months to build a building that magnitude. And people think, oh, the Pentagon, how big is it? Well, you could fit 17 Empire State Buildings inside the Pentagon.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how. Sorry, three Empire State Buildings inside the Pentagon. It had 17 miles of hallways. I mean, it's an astonishing
Yeah.
feat of construction. I mean, it's. Like if he could have built the Taj Mahal if he wanted to. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was.
And I think to this day, the Pentagon is still technically the largest office building in the world. So, I
It
mean,
is.
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, well, because it's not a skyscraper. So I think people don't view it as this big thing, but I don't know if you've been there. I've been there.
Yeah.
It is, yeah. I mean, you can look at one side of it and barely see end to end. So, what I found interesting though is, so Truman takes over. You have this Manhattan Project on its way. He's briefed on it. And then in June, he has meetings with the Joint Chiefs about, are we going to invade Japan? Are we not? What strategy are we going to use? The bomb is tested in July. But and I don't know if you found this and I've missed it, but it doesn't feel like there's one pivotal meeting where it's like, hey, we're going to drop this. It was almost like, we're building this, we're going to use it. We have the interim committee to figure out how, but Truman was never really in a meeting where it was like, yes, we're going to use this, we need, it was just kind of, this is what we've been working towards for 3 years. The question is, how are we going to use it?
Yeah, and that's a really great point. In fact, when I was out at the Truman Library, in the early 1950s, so soon after World War II, I think it was about the time that the Air Force was putting together its big history of World War II. And Truman was asked that question, like, where exactly did that meeting take place? And so he has his staff, he's still in the White House at this point. He has his staff go back and research it. And his staff basically comes back and they're like, we can't find the exact meeting where this decision was made, because Truman kind of writes in his memoirs, I made this decision on such and such. And he has a diary entry on July 25th that says, I've now made the decision. But what effectively comes back is that it's a decision that's essentially made in bits and pieces, particularly over a pivotal few days in July. And it got to remember, up until they know the bomb works, it's really this sort of abstract idea. Yes, we've got this, we've got this project, we spent all this money on it, but it's not until July 16th at 5:30 in the morning when that thing goes off, and they're like, okay, now we know it's going to work and it's going to be big. Now it's in high gear, and you see all the levers of government start moving very, very quickly at that point. So it's like the orders go out to the Pacific. They start moving the uranium, plutonium, the shell casings for the bombs. All that starts moving. And that point is Truman, of course, is out in Potsdam. And so what he's doing at that point is he's surrounded by FDR's former senior guys like George Marshall,
Yeah.
Joint Chiefs of Staff, de facto Chairman Admiral Leahy, Jimmy Burns, and there is a certain gravity, inertia that's pushing them toward the use of this. Uh, and it's people have tried to argue, well, of course, but Truman really doesn't even have a say in it all because the momentum was already there. And I don't really buy that. I mean, I think at the end of the day, he absolutely could have stopped it had he wanted to. I think the bigger question is why would he have wanted to stop it? He's already made this decision in June of 1945 to begin the invasion of Kyushu. Subsequent to that, the intelligence profile that's coming in on what Japan is doing in Kyushu is terrifying. They're, the original 3-to-1 invasion ratio that we thought we'd have, 3 Americans for every 1 Japanese
Yeah.
is actually going to be more like 1-to-1. Japan's got 5 million troops still under arms. They know where we're coming next. They can just look at a map of the Pacific and see that after Okinawa, you go to Kyushu. There's a real realization that this is going to be an ugly, awful fight. And as you noted, Truman's a World War I veteran. He's seen the horror of the trenches. He's seen all that. He's seen how bad Okinawa was, and he's doing everything he can to try and prevent it. So I think so he polls everybody, and I think at that point, they've been developing the press releases and the sort of the public relations infrastructure that's going to go alongside of it. But he doesn't. There is one document that I found and that I love. It's that it really comes down to it's a message to Truman, and it says, "Look, we've got this press release done now on the bomb, and we need you to approve it. We've changed things based now on the successful test of the Trinity. We need you to sign off on this thing." And so he literally flips this message over, and on the back he writes in pencil, he's like, "Approved, but whatever you do, don't release it before August 2nd." And that's about the only thing with his signature on it that talks about the
Yeah.
actual use of the bomb. And the reason he doesn't want it released before August 2nd is because he wants to be the heck out of Dodge before that thing goes off. And he's wrapping up in Europe at Potsdam, and he doesn't want to have to deal with Stalin after this bomb's gone off. He's like, I want to be out of here. I want to be on the ship home. So wait until I'm out of Europe, then drop it effectively. So I mean, yeah, I loved sort of piecing it together. Truman had to get his staff to help him piece it
Yeah.
together. I mean, it's one of those for such a momentous decision. You would think, we're going to go in this room, we're going to sit down, the meeting minutes are going to be kept. There's none of that, you know.
And I think it speaks to, in a way, that FDR had already made his decision on it, and then when he dies, Truman takes over. And we talked earlier about how far behind he was, that there was no formal process. I mean, again, you have the interim committee, you have the targeting committee, but no formal process with Truman saying, yes, do this, don't do, or just to your point, kind of those press release scribbles on the back, kind of being the only true connection there, which and your book too talks, because you mentioned the invasion of Kyushu and the plan there. You get into the planning for the invasion, Operation Olympic, which I was surprised would have been double the size of Normandy, which everyone thinks of, obviously greatest single operation in history. But you spent a lot of time going through the condition of the Japanese people in 1945, really starting in 44, but getting through 45. And it's just how vivid it is striking, and that it's a truly hopeless situation. And you get into some of the details about loaded train cars taking people out of cities, and in Black Snow you talk about the pure devastation of the fire raids and pavement melting and things like that. And it's interesting to me that as all this stuff is happening in America and with Truman and the decision, the lead up to using the atomic bomb, the situation in Japan, just day by day by day, is getting worse and worse and worse and worse.
Exactly, and I have a real affinity for Japan and the Japanese people. I mean, I've lived over there. I travel over there a lot. I mean, I was there twice this year. I love going there and visiting, and I've got great friends there. And so access to those materials, I think, is what makes like this book a lot richer, because people don't, for so long, a lot of American historians kind of gloss over the Japanese experience, and I wanted to kind of get into, because this is a book about the descent into total war. I mean, and that really for the Americans begins in earnest when the fire raid campaign begins, and then it sort of builds up to sort of the atomic bombs, which is really the zenith of total war. If you think when you reach the point where you can destroy an entire
Yeah.
city with one bomb, you've sort of reached the aerial Armageddon level, so to speak. And so I was very interested in the Japanese experience. And fortunately, I, having been to Japan, and the great thing about sort of doing these two books almost in tandem is that I did a lot of interviews. Sadly now people are passing away pretty regularly. I mean, even the folks
Yeah.
who were children at that time are now in their 90s, but I got access to a lot of people to be able to do interviews. I got access to diaries of average people to really kind of get into what it was like. And I found that to be a really fascinating story because it shows in part the struggle of what it was like to be living in Japan at that point was really tough. It was arduous. It was austere. There wasn't enough food. The average caloric intake was 1,600 calories. I mean, the infant mortality rate was rising. I mean, children were developing rickets, which is a disease from malnourishment. New mothers couldn't produce breast milk; they were so malnourished. People are they're stealing from one another. They're chopping down trees in parks for firewood. I mean, it's a miserable, miserable existence. And what it
Yeah.
does is it shows that despite that misery, you've got this reluctant, fanatical elements of their government that's like, we're going to keep fighting. We don't care how bad it is for the average person on the street. For us, we're going to continue to go. And I think that juxtaposition between that sort of fanaticism to push Japan toward really the brink of national suicide versus the misery of what it was like for the average person on the street is just it's illuminating. And I think it's an important perspective that Americans need to understand in order to understand that power dynamic in the Japanese government, that and why those last few days of the war and the decision making and what goes on is so important.
Yeah, and, like, you get into your book, there's a it's not just, okay, the B-29, it's the fire raids combined with the mining of harbors, combined with the submarine campaign, basically the disintegration of the railway system in Japan as well. So it wasn't just their buildings are getting bombed, it was people are starving, like you mentioned 1,600 calories a day, people are starving, but then there's this disconnect between, like you said, the leaders who say, we're going to move troops to Kyushu. We're going to fight on the beaches, even though back in Tokyo, Nagoya, these other, there might be people starving to death. But there was a total disconnect outside of, and you, I would be curious, and you correct me if I'm wrong. The only thing I remember of a Japanese leader going out among the people was Hirohito riding around after the March 9th raid around Tokyo. Other than that, it just seemed like there was a total disconnect between the leadership and the average people.
Totally, and and the great thing is I've kind of I wrote about the submarine war, I wrote about the conventional war, I've written, and so this is the one book where all those elements kind of get brought under one to kind of paint that whole picture of Japanese society. And you're absolutely right. Hirohito goes out for 1 hour after the March 9th raid, and it's his first
For
time
just
outside the
1 hour.
imperial. One
Okay.
hour. It's his first time
All
outside
right.
the imperial palace since October. So in 5 months, he's done nothing but live on this 531-acre compound. And so, meanwhile, the city outside around him is just, people are starving. It's beginning to burn. But there is this huge, huge disconnect there. And it's important to remember by the time the atomic bombs, there's nothing left of Tokyo. I mean, 56 square miles of that city are completely burned out. I mean, Manhattan Island is only 21 square miles. I mean, it's almost 3 times the size of New York
Yeah.
is gone. You've got hundreds of thousands of people living in the ashes of this. I mean, and I interviewed this one guy. He's a sea snob. He's a wonderful Japanese historian who survived it. I mean, a great quote from him in the book. He says, "We live like stray dogs." And that's kind of how the humanity had been reduced to this level of scavenging amongst the ashes to survive, while their leaders are still trying to prosecute this war. And had it not been for the way things come together in those last few days of the war, it might have gone on, and this horror might have gotten even worse. And so no, I think it's an important dynamic to explore for sure.
I want to get into what you just mentioned, the decision making at the end. And I'm not going to ask you to read multiple chapters of your book here because it's so detailed. And it is such a fascinating story because, on one hand, you have the American side, we're going to drop the bomb when it's ready, then we'll drop a second bomb. we're still preparing for an invasion. And on the Japanese side, you have really a lot, I don't want to call it indecision, but a lot of back and forth. But what are we actually going to do here? And I know Richard Frank, another historian, has called August 9th the decisive day where
Hmm.
the Russians declare war. There's a second atomic bombing. There's a meeting with the emperor that night. But it feels like it took months and months and really years of this back and forth. And then you get the current cabinet, which still is months of back and forth and secret peace feelers. And then all that, they agree to the Potsdam Declaration, but then there's a coup where they almost, I mean, it's just to me, I think it's one of those, you can say that week span from, August 9th or August 16th or how, one of those times where history was truly on the edge, I think one way or the other.
I say all the time, it's on the knife's edge right there. And I think people forget the decision to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki is probably the most consequential decision of the war. And it was originally not scheduled to happen so soon after Hiroshima. In fact, the second bomb was going to be dropped on August 11th. But folks like Leslie Groves and Curtis LeMay said, no, 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 we need to move heaven and earth. We need to get this second bomb on Japan right away because we need to continue to maintain the initiative. And what they didn't realize then that we know now is that inside Japan, after the bombing of Hiroshima, there's still you still have some of these fanatical military leaders who are like, well, the regime's still intact. We know what atomic energy is. We had our own very feeble effort at it. We know that the Americans, it's very expensive. It's very difficult to develop. They probably don't have more than one of these things. So why don't we just keep fighting? Nothing's really changed. And it's the decision to drop that second bomb so close after the first one that effectively just shoots down that whole argument, which is the Americans can drop these things every 75 hours, and that's how long the distance is, the time is between the dropping of Hiroshima is 75 hours. Then the Americans may have 20 of these things or 200 of these things, and at that point the realization begins to crystallize, which is our hope of this invasion, where we can just batter the Americans on the beaches and sort of force them into a more favorable conditions for us, may never materialize because they may never invade. I mean, why put your troops at risk if you've got this new bomb? You just sit offshore, drop one every 75 hours, boom, 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 and then eventually everything's gone. And that's that moment of psychological warfare when the Japanese realize the gig's up. Americans only, and the next bomb wasn't going to be ready till late August. We'd only have a handful more before the end of the year. So we really didn't have an arsenal of these things. We had a handful of them, but the Japanese didn't know that. And that's what prompts them to sort of Hirohito really on that night of August 9th as it rolls into the morning of August 10th to sort of cast that tie-breaking vote. He's got three of his war cabinet want to keep fighting, three want peace. That's when Hirohito steps in and says, you know what, now is the time to bear the unbearable. We got to get out of this war. And so that's that pivotal moment. And again, it's just that serendipitous time that the way the Americans dropped the bombs, the way the Japanese interpreted the back-to-back bombings, how it played out. It just worked, fortunately.
And I feel like too that August 14th, 15th might be one of the most pivotal 48-hour spans in all of human history, and at least in the 20th century, where there's nearly a coup for
Yes.
Japan to not broadcast their surrender, to keep fighting, which if that had worked, we would have been talking about an invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic, and it just barely doesn't work. You talk about that. Tell our viewers a little bit about that, because to me, that 48-hour span, one of the most pivotal spans, at least in the 20th century, if not all of history.
Absolutely. And what happens then is after Hirohito makes that decision, it's time for us to get out. Then it really comes down to sort of the negotiating, and the Japanese leaders kind of go back and forth with Truman a little bit on that. But effectively, Truman says you got to surrender unconditionally, and we know you want to keep the monarchy, but we'll let Douglas MacArthur make that decision. And Hirohito's fine with that, even though it means Hirohito could end up at the end of a rope. He says we got to get out of the war. So he's got to announce that to the Japanese public. And so rather than go live on the radio, of course, like you would nowadays, or we'd go on a podcast and do it, and stream it on everybody's phone. At that point, they make the decision that they're going to record it on a record. And so what happens is NHK, which is their equivalent of like an NBC or CBS, comes to the palace the night of the 14th. And Hirohito's aides, his cabinet secretaries, have actually taken his comments through a couple of these different meetings, and they've written what is effectively a 4.5 minute speech when it's read aloud. And in that 4.5 minutes, he surrenders, even though he never used the word surrender, but he basically says the word's over. And they record that on a record, and then they take that record very wisely and they lock it in the safe, but not like a typical safe. But they go over to the Empress's side of the palace and they hide it in one of her aide's safes. And then, of course, Hirohito goes off to his underground bunker that night or whatever. Well, anyway, always the big threat in Japan wasn't always the senior leaders. It was the fanatical junior officers who were just, and you see that in the 1930s with the junior officer coup, and you see that night too, which is you see some junior officers who murder the head of the Imperial Guard. They fabricate a fake order and they go and they basically seize the palace grounds. And when they seize the palace grounds, they happen to round up these guys from NHK. And as they're leaving, they're heading back, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we just recorded this record." And so then they're like, "Aha, we've got to get the record." And so it begins this scavenger hunt that's going to go on that night across this compound. And the Imperial Palace is pretty big. If you've ever been to Tokyo, you've seen how it's large, but it's not that large. And so they start hunting for it. Well, anyway, finally the word reaches out to the Second General Army that what's going on, and senior leaders go over there to try and break it up. But it's for several hours. It is a very tense moment. I mean, they are literally hunting not just the record, but also Hirohito to ostensibly take him into protective custody, or if necessary, kill him. And if they're successful, the war keeps going on. And Japan is doomed to even more casualties and more horror. And so too are the American troops. So and then what happens is after it's broken up, the conspirators then go to NHK and try to block the broadcast because the Hirohito's speech is going to be broadcast at noon the next day. And again, it takes quick thinking people at NHK who basically say, you know what, the cable line's down. We can't interrupt our broadcast now, because they were basically going to have a message saying about the coup and trying to kind of tell the public about it. And they're quick thinking civil servants who stop it. Now, I will say one of the fascinating things I love to do is, and I lead battlefield tours to Japan. I take guests over there. NHK has a museum in downtown Tokyo. And imagine if PBS had a museum, and you would go there and like you'd have puppets of like Big Bird and things like that. So you go to this NHK museum in Tokyo, and the first several floors are filled with that kind of stuff. It's a TV museum, right? But you go up to I think it's like the third or fourth floor, and in the far back, they actually have that record on display
Really?
there. And you can go there, and it's sort of tucked away. I always take guests there, and we go and we stand there. I'm like, this tiny record, that weighs just a few ounces is probably the most important artifact of World War II. And that here you have the Emperor's voice recorded, the one unifying person who can bring an end to this war. It's right there. And then you go outside the NHK Museum, and right across the parking lot, there's actually a monument to some of the conspirators out there. And so you've really got on the grounds there, you've got in downtown Tokyo this juxtaposition of these things. And so I find it to be such a powerful and pivotal moment, because it could have, what if they'd killed Hirohito? I mean, there are any number of different ways it could have gone down, and that would have all
Yeah,
been
I mean, there
so
was
bloody.
one good outcome and a lot of bad outcomes, and they got the one
Exactly.
good outcome. I mean, really. And James, I want to close by asking I ask most of my guests this question. It's a simple question, doesn't have a simple answer ever. You've researched this topic, you've written multiple books on it, obviously the most recent Empire of Ashes. If you had to encapsulate this book, this period of time, these decisions into a legacy, could you do that, and what would it be?
Wow, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that Truman's legacy is ending the war. There's no doubt about it, and ending it in the way he did. And Truman would tell you, obviously the atomic bomb is probably the most debated political decision ever made by a world leader. There've probably been more books and documentaries written on the atomic bombing than any other topic of World War II. And yet Truman would always tell you he never regretted that decision. In fact, even 13 years after the war, he ended up sparring with the Hiroshima City Council in this back and forth of letter campaign, because they got on him about, he was for publicly saying he didn't regret it. And he wrote him back and told him, how dare you? And he picks a fight almost in some ways with the mayor and city council of Hiroshima. But that's how much he believed in that decision. And I think he saw in front of him, as you just said, all these bad decisions, and he was looking for that sort of, how can we end this thing as fast as we can? And I think Truman viewed it a lot like ripping off a band-aid, which is, if you do it really fast, it's going to take some hair and a little bit of skin, and it's going to hurt, but then it's over. is unless you pull it very, very slowly, it's going to hurt and hurt and hurt and hurt. And I think he looked at the atomic bomb and ending the war in a similar fashion, which is we've got to hurry up and end it. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. Uh, but the alternative to drag this thing out is going to be a whole lot worse. And he defended that literally till the day he died. And I think that becomes the legacy for Harry Truman more than anything else.
All right. He is historian James M. Scott, author of Empire of Ashes, his newest book. As I said, someone who's reading it, it's a great book. Order it if you haven't already. James, I love this discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for joining me.
John, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. And stay tuned for the next episode of The John Lyons Show coming out soon.